Live. How are you, Amy?
Very well, thank you, Maria. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Listen, before we start, let me give you a formal introduction so we know a little bit about you. So, Amy Rowlinson is a leader in purpose and fulfillment with a fascination for understanding why people do what they do in life. Amy's on a mission to help entrepreneurs become values-based, purpose-driven, and people-centered. Amy helps people launch and relaunch profitable and purposeful podcasts focused on increasing their visibility, credibility, and impact, whilst inspiring, entertaining, and educating a global audience. At the heart of what she does is simple. She helps you to focus on why with clarity, uniting your passion and purpose with a plan to create the life you truly desire. Her second global podcast, Focus on Why, is now in the top 1% of podcasts. You heard it here first or second, probably. Over 165 episodes have been released, and the show is currently being downloaded in 85 countries. Here to answer all your podcasting questions to increase your visibility, credibility, and impact, we've got the expert. Amy, welcome.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. And yes, my episode 170 came out today. So I have been quite prolific in the last year at producing these podcasts.
Fantastic, fantastic. So listen, before we go into this, and please ask your questions in the comments. I will come to them certainly if they're questions that I haven't already prepared. I have a list, of course. Really stupid question, but there might be somebody out there, you never know, somewhere on the planet that does not know what a podcast is. What is the definition of a podcast?
That's a great question. So a podcast is simply an amalgamation of two words, iPod and broadcast, and it's a voice-only digital audio file. That's it. And it's made available on the internet. So many people upload them into a distribution platform. I use Libsyn. There are many others available. And then it filters out to wherever people can download their podcasts on whichever platform or device they're using.
I use Libsyn too. I'm happy now because you're in the top 1% and I use Libsyn too. There is hope for me. What's really irritating for me, Amy, is that I found you after 3 years of podcasting, and I wish I had found you day one, because you would have made me think about things very differently. And the very first thing you should be asking yourself are 3 key questions, I believe. What are they?
So I believe that you should be asking, well, with a focus on why, that's naturally the question I'd be asking. What is the purpose of your podcast? Who is it for? Who is it going to be serving? And what problem does it solve for your audience? Now, that's from a business perspective. If it's solving a problem, it could be that you are an entertaining podcaster. So you could be a case of what makes your show unique. And I guess it's about working out what the benefits are for you and for your business.
That's a really good point. And actually the whole audience thing is so important. I've learned that now because I've tried to cover too big an audience, but we'll come to that later. Okay. How do you know if podcasting is right for your business?
Well, it's a case of understanding how it fits in with the strategic element of your business. So is it that you are going to be bringing it in your space of expertise? Are you a speaker? A lot of people who are speakers, they can demonstrate their ability in conveying what it is their message is with the audience. But it's actually really important to understand what it is as part of your business, going to fit in, how it's going to be, I guess, commercial from day one, because it is a lot of time that you can spend on your podcast. So it's understanding what the return on investment is going to be for you as a medium. Is it the right medium for you to be conveying your message? Are your audience, the people you're working with in your business actually going to be listening in the audience? Otherwise, you might as well not bother. So it's understanding who it is you are going to be speaking to. Are they listening? And if so, what do they want to hear?
Really good point. And is there a sort of a consideration about, timing? When is the right timing to launch a podcast?
In terms of the days or months, or what's the time?
No, in terms of your business, when's the right time to launch a podcast in your business?
Again, it's all about how does it fit in from a strategic element. So what is that podcast going to be delivering? Where does it slot in? So for me, I launched my podcast for my business to understanding that it was going to be linked to my coaching work. I didn't know exactly how. I just knew that it had to be out there. And then actually over the last few months, I've started to really work out more the strategy behind it. But I just knew that it was something that was the next stepping stone for me in my business. So it's understanding, I guess, the right time for you and having those blinkers on, because so many people have different strategies and don't think that you're just going to copy someone else and say, well, it's going to work for them, it's going to work for me. So again, it comes down to fitting it in with your audience, understanding who's listening, what benefits are they going to be getting out of these episodes. And also from the perspective of, if you're at the start of your business and you are launching, you've got to build an audience, and you can do that alongside your podcast release of episodes. But it's great to know that you've already got an established audience. That's going to help with your numbers. But I don't want people to get focused on the numbers and stop them from actually launching. Because when I first started with my first podcast, I didn't really have a huge audience. I had a co-host who had a larger social media profile than I did. But I knew from day one that we would just start building up that audience in the same way that if you have a networking event or if you've got a social media presence, you start and organically you grow. But the reason you're going to grow well and you're going to increase the numbers of your downloads is through providing great content. So at the point where you know you've got value to add, that's when you should be starting your show.
Really good advice, really good advice. And so we're doing a live stream here, obviously. And what's the benefit of doing a podcast versus a live stream? And incidentally, I'm going to turn this into a podcast, by the way, just so you know in advance.
So live stream, people can listen. That we're doing it over lunchtime today, so people are going to be able to down tools and listen in. But the great thing about a podcast is that people get to choose when they want to listen to the content that you're providing. So they're not being dictated that you have to tune in at this specific moment. They can hands-free, eyes-free, take a podcast in their own space when they're ready to receive that information. So it's available as an asset. It sits in the platform that you've uploaded it to, and it's there available 24/7 globally, because this is not just a local audience, and it's very much available across all the platforms. So for me, it's an opportunity for you to do something once and then for it to be downloaded for as long as you want it to be accessible. So that's the benefit. And I talk about the hands-free and eyes-free. What I mean there is that people don't have, you can plug in your podcast and you can go on a walk, you can exercise, you can do the shopping, you can do whatever you're doing, and you can tune in. But because it's just audio, because it's voice only, it means that you can do other things. So people do go on exercise as they're walking, or they are driving, whatever they may be doing. But what's interesting is, because with a podcast, they're already doing something. They don't tend to be surfing on the internet at the same time. They're focused on what you're saying. So where you're listening to something which is on Facebook Live, you're going to get notifications pop up on your phone, and you're going to be distracted sometimes. So for me, having a podcast, apart from it being in a separate asset and you've got that brilliant resource that you can refer people to, it's just that ability of it being eyes-free, hands-free, and free to access.
I love that. We will be taking questions from anybody. I can see that we've got Simon and Olga here. Thank you very much. Love to see you, and any others that you hear. Do add any questions. We will have time for questions, of course, because we're going through my questions quite rapidly. She's very efficient, Amy. No waffle, straight to the point. I love that. Absolutely love that. So, okay, here's the thing, right? There's a lot of noise out there. There's so much noise. Isn't it overcrowded? I mean, I think is it 2.3 million podcasts?
Yeah, we're just shy of that number at the moment. I think I checked earlier and it was 295,814 at the last count. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say there's a lot of podcasts out there, but not all of those are active. A lot of those have suffered from pod fade over the recent years. They're still there, but they're not live and active podcasts. So the difference is you are probably only about 850,000, and globally that's not that many. And because of the way that they're categorized, there are different categories where your podcast sits. Again, you're then reducing the number of podcasts out there. So if you compare it to the number of blogs or the number of YouTube channels, or even the number of books where you can access similar types of information, you're actually in a much smaller space. And the podcasting space is growing. We know that it's really changed. When I first launched this podcast a year ago, we'd just hit 1 million. We've now doubled that in a year. And if you think about that exponential growth compared to the previous sort of 10 years, 10, 15 years since podcasting has been available, that's big growth in the last year or so, partly due to probably lockdown. and COVID, but also just because it is a growing medium as well.
You mentioned, I had to write it down, you mentioned a phrase, you said pod fade. I think I know what it is, but talk to me about pod fade. It sounds very painful.
Well, essentially all it is that people think, oh, I'm going to launch a podcast, and they have best intentions. They go out there and they launch a few episodes, and then they realize what's involved in a podcast. And there is a lot more work to sustaining a podcast than people realize. So that's when quite a lot of people drop off. Or they may have just used it as a particular channel to release a series or so, but they don't want to continue. So it sits there and it stays there, and it's accessible. Or they might archive it. They might make it not available for you. But yeah, pod fade is the technical term used in the space for those particular episodes or podcasters that don't keep going.
Okay, somebody said to me, and I don't know if it's true, you may know or may not know, that you need to get over sort of 45 episodes before the platform even takes you seriously. Is that just a number somebody put out there for me, or is there any evidence to support that?
I haven't the evidence to know that that's the magic number. I know that there are some episodes or podcasts that have had fewer numbers and had huge numbers of downloads. So I think essentially when you're launching, there's certain things that you can do to help really spike the algorithms and really push out your podcast into a global space. But I mean, I think that if you are going to be taken seriously, it has to be something where you are regularly adding content so that people can see that consistent value that you're bringing to the table. But I haven't heard that particular number, so I can't say either way whether that's the case.
Okay, I'm going to go to one of our listeners, viewers, and take a question. And I'm going to try something I've not done before. There you are. I'm showing it the question there so you can see it too. So Simon asks, what does Amy think about Anchor versus Libsyn or Acast? Anchor purchased by Spotify. Spotify payments, recent news, ? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, all I know is that I've used Libsyn. It was recommended to me when I first launched my first podcast, and I know that there are other platforms available for distribution. Anchor makes it accessible because it has the free option, but they also then have the rights to the content. So I want to keep the rights of my own content. I want to be able to do what I want with the whole content and not put any ads or sponsorship inserted into those. So that's my preference, and other people have different preferences. So there is a huge change in the way that the distribution of podcasting and the way that it's going to be delivered now that Apple and Spotify have released the ability to monetize podcasts, to have different subscription levels. So we're going to see a very different way of podcasting, but I haven't got any sort of knowledge on those other platforms because they're not ones I've used.
That's interesting. So I've actually used both Anchor and Libsyn. Anchor is incredibly easy, really, really easy. I did find that my podcast got better reach on Libsyn, but I don't know if that was because the quality of the podcast that I put on Anchor may not have been as good as the quality of the one on Libsyn. But I find Libsyn very robust, reliable, and quite simple to use. I trust it. So it's interesting that we've both ended up there. You mentioned the magic word, monetize. Can you monetize a podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why people go into podcasting, because of the monetization options. And there's different ways that you can categorize this. It's important to sort of understand that you can either directly or indirectly monetize it. So directly is quite overt. So you have people who sponsor your show, or you have affiliates or affiliate marketing links in various ways that you are, even product placements if you're doing the sort of very specific episodes where you talk about something and you can then have that show endorse, or you're endorsing products. And then indirectly, purely by showing what you're capable of doing, you are going to get clients to come in from and want to work with you from what you're sharing. And that's the kind of the position that I have. I have a lot of people that come to me for coaching work. And that was from my previous podcast, which is the Property Vault podcast. People wanted to do some direct podcast mentoring with me, property mentoring with me. And then from this podcast, which is focused on why, which we're talking about today, it's more from the purpose perspective and also from podcast mentoring. So those are very good ways of monetizing it. And in terms of prospecting, that's one of the things I think is fantastic. And that what I mean by prospecting is you're bringing people onto your show and giving them airspace, and they like working with you. They really enjoy the way that you hold the space, and then they go to subsequently work with you afterwards because of your expertise in this area. So you can actually reach out to some pretty high level guests and then end up working with them in different ways, collaboratively or as clients.
Excellent. And I'm hoping that people will reach out to you for your wonderful expertise on podcasting too. Tell me though, with regards to monetizing, where you're having maybe a sponsor or you're having somebody coming in and you've got a product placement, etc. How do you do that without disrupting the flow of the podcast? I find it quite irritating sometimes, personally.
Well, it's really interesting you say that you find it irritating, and it may be that it wasn't a particularly congruent message that they were sharing, because actually the ad avoidance, which plagues many marketing, is different on podcasts. People actually don't mind them, and the numbers that are banded around in respect to that is that I think it's up to 78% actually approve of podcast sponsorships and find them memorable and motivating. But that's when there's a great alignment, and this is what I find is more it's more specific with podcasting, because what you're doing is, if you are aligning your show with a particular product or service, it has to be in alignment with what you're offering. And I talked about this off air earlier, Maria. When you are endorsing somebody and you're bringing them onto the show, people trust you and they trust them, because they've been listening to your show, they trust you, and it's really important then that the people that you bring onto your show are people that you would recommend as well. And from that perspective, you might, when you said you found it irritating, it might be that it's just like, this doesn't make sense. What is this about? Because if it was the right type of sponsorship or advertising, it wouldn't jar so much. And it's also about where they position it. So you've got 3 different positions generally that are used, which are sort of pre, during, mid and post roll. And you get different sponsorship deals with people wherever you position it. And also you could have it in your own, woven in your own speech, or you could have it as a separate recorded message. So there's a lot of care to be taken, because it is, as you say, we've been talking about it, there's a lot of trust involved in podcasting.
Okay, that's great. You're absolutely right. The adverts, the ads that irritated me were the ones that I thought, this doesn't fit. Absolutely right. So I would just, because you can go forward, can't you? So just forward on them. Naughty. Okay, we will come back to some more questions from anybody listening in and viewing too, but I want to go into the common mistakes people make, because I love talking about mistakes. Tell me about the mistakes people make with their podcast, and I can then tick each one that I've done.
All right, okay. So people shoehorn their show into their business. So they think, right, I'm going to do a podcast along this, and it works because of what they're doing in their business. And it may be that it's just not the right platform to be distributing that. So they start off thinking, yes, this is great, and then they realize that it is not the right thing to do. They repurpose content as opposed to specifically thinking about their podcast audience. So they're just chucking out things that they've done elsewhere, and it doesn't make sense, because they're starting saying, hey, how are you doing? How's everything going? And it's a Facebook Live that they've done, and they spend 5 minutes saying hello to everybody. And people who are listening from a podcast perspective don't get the context. It doesn't make sense, and it's not relevant. It's just not fair. So that, I would say, those are sort of 2 big mistakes. Overcommitting and then under delivering, and not being able to keep up with the consistency, I think, is something that a lot of people do in podcasting. It is a lot of time, and if you're going to do it well, focus on what you can deliver and do that consistently well. I would much rather someone put out 2 episodes a week that were brilliant than 5 episodes that were fairly average. So I think the other thing is the actual standard of the quality of the sound, making sure that people have got great tech, and also when they've got an interview with someone, that their guest has got a good sound as well, because quite often you'll hear a really huge difference. The guest is not very clear, whereas the host is super clear, and you're constantly having to adjust that in your ear, and it's just not great, sort of up and down the levels. So having an understanding from the tech perspective, I think, is good. And if you can't do that, outsource it. And just making sure you're connecting with your audience, bringing them in, engaging them. It's such a personal, intimate space, a podcast. You've got the three perspectives. You've got the host, you've got the guest, and you've got the listener. And if it's just you as a single host, you've got the host and the listener. And I like to take off a lot of conversations offline. So I have a huge amount of conversations with my audience around what I've been producing from a podcast. So quite often people just put the podcast content out there and then just let it sit, and they're not doing all the sort of the legwork behind. So I don't know how many of those you ticked, but I doubt though you ticked many.
Well, no, interesting. The whole sound thing was a real big issue. And actually, I mean, the pandemic has done one good thing. People have upgraded their tech. So now if I have a podcast guest, more often than not, they actually will have decent sound. And obviously, it's lovely to have you on here because you're a podcaster, so you've got great sound. I've got my lovely mic too. So the sound thing is absolutely crucial. And the point about taking stuff, you know, live and putting them into podcasts, I have done that, but what I have done is I've put an introduction and I've explained it. So I'm glad you've said to do that, because if it's relevant to the audience, I like to do that, and we will be sharing this. And in fact, you might be listening to this on the podcast. Hello, anybody who is. And what I have found very irritating is there's a particular podcaster whose content I love. He's actually an expert. I don't want to mention names, but he often will record his stuff when he's actually walking along the beach. And so you've then got the sound of the waves, you've got the sound of the wind, you've got his, you know, and it's like, why are you doing this? You're such an expert in your area. And it's also quite clear that he gets distracted. You know, the dog runs past, so he gets distracted, he loses his train. And I thought, and I want to hear your wonderful stuff, but do you know what? It's too hard, so I give up. So a lot of the stuff you're saying, totally get it. And of course, the whole point about, you know, doing the podcast is just part of the whole piece. It's about, you have to promote it, you have to then do more with it. I totally agree. Simon has another question. I think Simon has a list, so let's see. Let me bring Simon's next question in. Any views on Twitter Spaces and Clubhouse rooms, spaces being recorded and turned into podcasts? Oh, that probably links into what you've just said, actually.
Yeah, so there are ways that people are doing that, and they're being really quite technical. They've got various gadgets, and I can't remember the name of it, but they've got these fantastic ability to do that. Again, it's a case of being very clear from the outset. I know that Clubhouse initially has said that they don't want things recorded, so you need to get permission from people to do so. It's very clear that you've got the ability to do that and that you've got their permission. I don't want to be recording anything that is not acceptable. That's why I send out guest release forms to all of my guests to make sure that they're happy with the content of what I'm sharing and where I'm sharing that. So in terms of using Clubhouse, and you mentioned Twitter Spaces as well. I'm just looking at the question. Again, it's a case of, is that of value? What is it that you're sharing, and is it going to be valuable to your audience? And if so, right from the outset, be very specific about how this is going to be received in the podcast space. So the Clubhouse has been absolutely phenomenal for conversations, and podcasts again is a great space for conversations, but be very clear and be inclusive in what you're doing in terms of, are you serving both audiences? If not, I would stick to the one medium, serve them well, and then use the other medium to serve that audience separately.
Super. I hope that answered that question, Simon. Thank you very much for that. Any more questions for anybody else? Please carry on. I have some more, so we can carry on still. Are you okay? You're working hard here, Amy.
Yeah, it's great.
And I need to send you a release now as well. I realise guest release form. Okay. What are the key components to get started?
So I'll go through 10 different steps that I take my
10
podcast. Yeah, 10 sounds a lot.
I bet I didn't do that. I bet I didn't do all 10. Go on, then I'm going to be ticking them off again.
So let's go through this. So the key components are to make sure you've got the purpose, to understand who your show is for and how you're serving them. Okay, and that links into the audience and understanding who your ideal listener is from a really good perspective. And then the concept, and I talk about the construct of the show, talk about how you are going to be delivering that. Is it going to be a case of you being a solo host, or are you going to be bringing in guests? Are you going to be co-hosting, or are you going to be doing a combination, a blend of all of those? And then it's a case of understanding the branding. Is this going to be a separate piece? Is this even a passion project? Is it something that is part of your business, or is it something that you want to deliver from a different perspective? So again, that links in with the purpose. But the branding, again, is it going to be a standalone, separate name from your podcast, from your business, or is it named the same as your business? So really understanding and how you're going to be fitting into that category that you're going to be placed amongst with all of the other podcasts. How do you stand out? And again, the strategy, this is something that's really important. We talked about the strategic element and the vision of what that podcast is going to achieve for you, for your personal brand, for your business brand, for your business, and the process. So this is understanding all the different elements that are involved and how you're going to be delivering that. Who's going to be doing different elements? Are you going to be outsourcing different elements of the actual production of your podcast? Because there are quite a few moving parts involved. And with that is the technology. So understanding that you've got the right technology to distribute and to record, to produce and distribute your shows. Expertise, how to be a great host. You see so many people who are great in business, but they're not naturally great as being a host. So it's understanding what skills you would need to brush up on to really understand how to connect with your audience and connect with any guests that you bring on the show. Time, really important to know how much time you can afford, what the return on investment that you're going to be getting out of this show, and how it folds into your weekly or daily schedule even. And then it's the launch, understanding how you can really get that launch right, because that's the foundation for your show being visible in the space. And if you get the launch right, you're then going to get all of the other elements of how to grow and build your audience right as well.
Wowzers. Wowzers, wowzers, wowzers. You're a font of knowledge. That's phenomenal. Thank you for that. I made some notes. I'll have to come back and read. I might have to transcribe this and this is like a masterclass. Tell me, so for anybody who has a podcast already, what advice would you give? And maybe it's part of it before you even launch it, but what can you do to build your audience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, and
That's
it's
a
also
big topic.
Well, it's also about turning your audience into super fans. You're turning them into people who will rave about your show without you having to do anything. I absolutely love, it's one of my favorite things, is to go onto social media and see that someone's posted about a particular episode that they've just listened to and what they've got out of it. That for me is everything. That's why I do this, because what they've done is they found value in it and they've gone that extra length to then share it with their network. And that's how I've organically grown. I haven't done a single paid ad. I haven't done any type of paid marketing. It's all been through organic growth on my own social networks. And so, yes, it's involved my time, but it has been through connecting with people who I know value the show and then asking them to share it through the podcast. That's what I say. That's my sort of call to action at the end of the show. If you've enjoyed it, leave me a review and share it and join the community. And that's what people have done. And that's how I would recommend building your audience, is having a very clear call to action of what you want people to do as a result of listening into your episodes. And that is key to understand also where your audience hangs out, and go there and hang out with them. Ask the questions that they need answers to, or answer the questions they need answers to, rather, and just know them in detail. It's just really understanding who you're serving, and also understanding how your show is being of benefit. I'm very clear to bring people onto the show and to share what they've done. My episode 100 last year was all about that. It was about bringing the listeners onto the show and then sharing what they'd achieved, what ripple effects had been caused from listening in.
Oh, I'm going to pinch that idea. I like that. That is really cool. And also, I one of the mistakes people make, I don't have that call to action at the end of my podcast to say, if you like it, which is probably why I don't have it shared as often as you have yours shared, because mine relies on the most amazing guests. I've had incredible guests. So yeah, I shall be adding that call to action. Thank you. This is all about learning for me, really.
And with that, Maria, just to say with that, Maria, about having great guests on your show, It's often because they are so well established that you think that by them coming onto your show and being lesser established, that they are going to catapult you into a different sphere. It often doesn't work that way. I found that the people who are lesser known have made more impact on my podcast visibility, purely because those people have worked harder to share my podcast, and then in that respect, more people have then been keen to understand what it was that they shared, and they've listened to it, and then they've shared it because they resonate, they relate to that person more so than having a higher profile guest on.
Now you tell me. So a bit late now, never mind. It was 3 years, it's all right, it's okay. So listen, let's say people don't want to start a podcast for whatever reason, but they would like to be a good guest. What advice can you give? And I could probably give a bit of advice on this too, having had lots of guests. How do you become a good guest?
Okay, so this is a great question, because actually being a sort of still pod guest, just podcast guest, is actually a great strategy to increase your visibility and your credibility in a space. But again, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier with the congruence of being in the right space. In terms of, you were talking about that ad not working. Again, make sure that if you're going on as a guest in a show, it's in the right space for you, that it's actually right in your audience is going to be right. You're going to be speaking to the right audience, and you're going to be bringing value. So I would have a pre-call with a host of that show, and I'd say, can you explain to me what it is you would like me to share? What it is that your audience wants? What is it that I could bring to the table? And they will be very grateful that you spent that time to do that sort of pre-qualification call. And also, if it's not a right fit, you both then say, let's not waste each other's time, and respect one another for that, and say, this might not be the right show for me to come on. And I think that would stand you in good stead. And, for me, I always do that with all of my guests, and I'll say, this is what the show's about, this is what we're going to cover, and is that something that you'd be interested in? And it then gives them the opportunity to say yes or no as a guest. So if you have a very clear idea of what you can and what you can't say, and how also that interview is going to be structured. So do they want to be freestyle? Do they want to have prepared questions? Do they want it to be quite spontaneous? And also, are you allowed to share what you do? Ask them beforehand, is it okay if I say that I do this? Is it okay that I direct people to this point? And then that way you're gaining permission ahead of time without and gaining the respect of the host, because you're spending a lot of time in one another's space, and it is so personal. It is such a great space that you are giving them the trust that you deserve from that perspective.
Fantastic. Agree with all of that. Absolutely agree with all that. And then the silly things, which we talked about before, the tech. If the host says, please use a headset, the reason is because you don't want feedback. It's not because, you won't look as good if it's being recorded on video unless you hide it like you have with your hair. But, it's really important. And, use a good mic and turn off all your flipping alerts. Drives me nuts. I always say to people, turn off the alerts, and then you have bing, email coming, bing, email coming. It's like, because I try to avoid doing too much editing personally, so I try to do it in one hit, which means I can't stop and say, or I can't say, because I don't want to be taking it out. So that's really important. And dogs barking, children coming in, interruptions. This is professional. Treat it professionally. So silly stuff, not high level like your stuff, but silly stuff that nonetheless irritates.
It makes a lot of sense though, Maria, to have those, because it is very disruptive for the ear. When we have video, we're much more forgiving, but when we've only got our ears, we are less forgiving, and it is very, very distracting. So it's really important that you have all of those smaller details taken care of. And again, it is just basic common courtesy as a guest to come on. There are always going to be a distraction at some point. That's fine, but as long as it's not, you've eliminated the majority of them.
Okay, super. So we've probably got another 5 minutes or so if anybody wants to ask another question. But while we're waiting for any more questions, Amy, if anybody wants your support and advice and assistance, and I highly recommend it, and I wish I had done it 3 years ago, what's the best way to contact you?
Just go to my website. It's amyrowlinson.com.
As simple as that. Okay.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to listen to the show, it's Focus on Why. It's available on all platforms. But if you would like to work with me, the simple way is to go to my website. I have a link there where you can apply to have a call with me, and we can just set up a 20-minute call and see how I can help you with your show. And that could be for either if you're going to launch or relaunch it.
Fantastic. So it looks like we've got no more questions from our audience here. Is there anything you would like to leave our viewers and our listeners with? Any thought with regard to podcasting? Is it worth it? Here's the last question for you.
Well, that's really interesting, because when I first started podcasting, I didn't even know what a podcast was. And for me, I've had personal benefits and business benefits. So from personal benefits, you're going to increase your visibility, your credibility, your authority, your inspiration, connection, collaboration, monetization. But also from my perspective, it's given me a voice. It's given me the opportunity to increase my confidence. It's been a huge amount of fun, can't tell you that, but it's given me clarity in my direction, in my business and in my life. And it's made me a better communicator. And I now hold much better conversations. I've removed all of those fillers that we tend to use sometimes, the ums, the ers, the you knows, the likes, all of those, they've disappeared because I now know how annoying they are from my husband's perspective to have to edit them all out. So I'm much more considerate about that. But it's just about the opportunities. You will open doors through podcasting that you just would not believe. As I said before, it's about having that space where you have a very personal conversation with someone, bringing in people onto a show. You're in a bit of a revered status. There aren't as many podcasts out there as there are opportunities to have YouTube channels or Facebook lives. So, and again, there are much less podcasters than there are authors. So a podcast is a great medium for your business.
I love that. And all that's left to say, because I have been trained today, is if you enjoyed this, please leave a review and share it. Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.